Hey guys, it's Joel, and today we're going to talk about eye movement therapies because that's what I get the most questions about, is how do I tell the difference between all these different kinds of therapy. And you mentioned a lot of different kinds of therapy, which one is best for me. So the second question, we'll wait until the next video. This one is about eye movement therapies, which are EMDR, EMI, Brainspotting, and now ETT, which I just got trained in last weekend. We'll get into it. I have some fruit here, and I have 2 cups of green tea, one for you and one for me. The first thing that is the most popular form of eye movement therapy, if you're not familiar, is called EMDR. EMDR is invented by Francine Shapiro, and it is by far the most widely adopted. And so you can kind of find like an EMDR clinician almost anywhere. In the 80s and the 90s, it was still talked about like it was kind of cranky and like the people who were doing it were silly. And now if you're a trauma therapist, you're kind of behind the times if you don't have it. Most people have it or have something based on it. And the thing about EMDR is that it does, I was just kidding about making a tea for you because obviously you're watching YouTube. I actually bought 2 different kinds of green tea, the name brand and the Walmart brand, and I was going to see if there was a difference, if it was worth it to save $4. So I'll let you know that too at the end of the video. This is, what's the name brand here? Bigelow. Yeah, that's the Bigelow. So this one I usually get pretty good. So Francine Shapiro realized she had PTSD, and she realized that her PTSD was soothed when she moved her eyes back and forth, and so she built a protocol around that. EMDR works. I'm not a critic of it. I'm a critic of parts of it, and people will send me emails. So EMDR is based on basically left and right eye movements, and so with EMDR, you're starting and you are doing eye movements like this as a therapist. And then the patient is following those eye movements with their eye. And the thinking about this was, which is a perfectly fine theory in 1982, is that you moving back and forth your eyes is somehow activating the same process that happens when you're going into REM sleep, where your eyes move back rapidly. That involves both hemispheres of the brain changing and sharing and integrating information. And so that's kind of what Shapiro was assuming. She writes everything about bilateral stimulation. So EMDR uses something, if you don't want to use the visual, or for children or for different cases, called buzzies, where there's like a thing that goes zzz, 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 and buzzes in each hand to activate both hemispheres of the brain, or in theory. They also use tapping sometimes. The clinician does this. To my knowledge, there is almost no research done about buzzies or tapping. All the research when you look for EMDR is done with somebody moving their eyes back and forth. So Francine Shapiro's theory that the brain works like that is perfectly fine. We just have 30 more years of neuroscience research, and what she thought was happening in the brain is not actually what happens. And so it's not that EMDR doesn't work. EMDR is based on an assumption that just happens to not be right. And so one of my criticisms of EMDR, and it's not even a criticism, it's just I don't care what you do. One of the reasons that I personally don't like it is that it's extremely manualized. Francine Shapiro was famous for saying, if you change my model, you are not doing my model. You are doing something else, so don't call it EMDR. So when somebody says, okay, you do the 15 eye movements, and then you do the 25, and then you go back and you do the 15, someone was like, well, the patient's liking this, or this is happening, like, why don't I do something else? When that would happen, she would say, no, you got to do this. And so that was kind of what happened to me. I encountered that resistance. So I came to eye movement therapy by doing EMDR first. That's what I got trained in. I got a lot of training in it. And I was very insecure about going into practice as like a trauma therapist. And yeah, so this is what I picked in the beginning of the video when I was trying to throw some color in there to make comments about color later. I bought this as a peach tree, but you can see that it's completely slick and hairless. And I'm wondering if it's not a hybrid of a peach and a nectarine, because it kind of tastes like that. Anyway, that's an aside, but I don't know. So I was like a social worker. I wanted to go to private practice. I knew trauma was like what I wanted to do, because my theory working in the hospital was that trauma is what was fueling a lot of the genetic disorders that I was treating, different disorders. The genes kind of determine the expression of it, how it's expressed, but trauma was the fuel for the expression, then you didn't really need as much or any medication if you're able to treat the trauma, because I'd seen that happen when people went, into the private practice places. So I got the EMDR training, and my immediate assessment of it when I used it on every patient that I had for the week that I got it was, this works. It works miracles for about 20 to 30% of people. It does nothing for about 65, 75% of people. And so why is that? And so I started putting these different things together about who is this working for, what kind of diagnosis do they have, how does their personality work. People who tend to be very suggestible and not have a lot of defenses, EMDR tends to work faster. And I don't mean that you're suggesting that they feel good and then they feel good. EMDR does do something in the brain. Like, eyes are related to how we feel. They're one of the fastest ways to get into the subcortical brain where trauma is stored. One of the reasons that is that all of our other senses filter through the front, the prefrontal or the midbrain, the neo or the mid-cortex. And so, like, when you smell something, smell is the most tied to memory. It goes very far into the midbrain. Everything else kind of filters through this, so it's coloring your cognition, but you're thinking about it. It's able to be perceived. Sight does not work that way. You cannot directly perceive the things that you see. Your visual optic nerve is the only sense that doesn't go through the rest of the brain. It goes directly back to the brainstem. Okay, so that optic nerve shoots back through your brain and it connects to this brainstem, because the latency has to be very low. Like when you're building a computer, you put the things together that have to talk the fastest. Like the RAM is right next to the processor, and the VRAM is actually right on the memory card or right on the CPU. Like if you're not familiar with building a computer, disregard that. That sounded like Greek. But you put the things that have to talk the most really close together so that the latency is low. And with eyes, this is our lizard brain. It's the thing that evolved in us before all the mammal bits and all the monkey bits and all the human bits, much later on. And so that the lizard sees something, and then it has to eat it. It has to know, based on this color or based on the shape or based on whatever visual stimuli, do I jump forward and eat it, or do I jump back and get away? This color brown is a moth. If I don't eat it, I starve. This color brown is an owl. If I don't jump away from that, I'm going to die. Right? So that's pretty important information that happens really fast. And the body has to move before the mid and the prefrontal cortex are even thinking, right? So if you go out and you're in a movie theater and somebody stands up and they take their pants off, you're not thinking oh, that's against the social norm, that's so weird, but you're just like, what the heck? And then all of a sudden you start to realize, what do I do? How do I get out of here? But your body is getting that information first based on visual stimuli, which is one of the ways that eye movement therapies are able to activate the subcortical brain so quickly and cure trauma so much faster than other modalities. Other modalities work, but you're getting someone to think and reason and cognitivize, and then you're getting them to feel, and then you're getting them to go beneath feeling and think about belief and energy and how my body responds. That takes months, and it works, and I do that, a lot of therapists do that. But if you can do something in days or minutes, why not do that? So EMDR is made by Francine Shapiro and kind of got off into the woods. My immediate reaction to it is this works miracles for a small amount of people. And so I talked to everybody that I could get a hold of who had talked to me that was doing EMDR and doing it well and was well respected as a clinician. And all of them kind of said the same thing, which validated my theory. I saw they were kind of chasing that miracle. But the majority of people who came in, it didn't really work. But the people who it helped so much that they changed their life. And sometimes almost like a spiritual thing happens in them. Like the person has gone to every kind of therapist. They've been in cognitive therapy for years, and then they go to the narrative therapist, and the narrative therapist says, here's the baby shoe, and it's right next to the big boot. So can't you see that and understand that it's not your fault that dad molested you or uncle molested you because the power dynamic? No, it's my fault. I did it. There's something that's stuck in the emotional belief system, and then somebody just does EMDR, and that person's like, oh my God, I was 7. It's not my fault. And you're chasing that miracle where these people have these profound experiences, but those don't happen for most people. Okay, so when I was doing that, I was like, why is this, what's happening? What's actually happening in the brain? And that was kind of in my head, and that was what I was, that was what I was trying to figure out. And yeah, that's the great value. That's the Walmart one. Not as good. Go ahead and spend the $4 extra for the 40-pack green tea and get the Bigelow one, because the Walmart one is a little weaker. It's not really as good. So, I was noticing when I was doing EMDR with people who had severe and complex trauma, that, the processing goes all in the room. With EMDR, what you see in the room is what you get. So you're doing your EMDR, and the person starts to feel worse, and then they stabilize, and then they feel better, and then they're like, oh my God, thank you so much. But then they would go home, not everybody, this is, we were a complex trauma clinic, I was working in a complex trauma clinic at the time. People are like, I feel so, bad, and so one way that happens is like somebody might come in and they're like, I want to treat this, horrific abuse that my dad did. So we do it. Oh my gosh, I'm free from that. I feel wonderful now. They go home about a week later. Oh my God, I have this wonderful relationship with Mom. I thought Mom was my protector. Mom was an angel. She was watching me. She didn't protect me. Now I don't even have a moral center in my life. Okay, so the person's destabilizing. They're missing work. I'm like, oh my gosh, let me clear my schedule. I'll see you at the end of the day. And so, I always would say, we're clearing out a well here, right? We get something off the top. Maybe another stick or something bubbles up. We'll get that too. We gotta wait till it breaks loose and comes up, but eventually we're gonna run out of stuff. We'll get out of the well. Well, that works, but it can take months. And that's one of the risks with the EMDR. If you have somebody who is an authentic, borderline attached person, if they have complex trauma, I say authentically borderline because I think borderline is handed out in kind of a sexist way, and in kind of an uninformed way. If you're a woman who tries to kill yourself or has any kind of emotional reaction, go to the ER, they're going to say a lot of the time that you're borderline, they're not going to find out is your anxiety warranted, did you deserve that diagnosis, are you having a normal reaction to what happened outside of the ER? It is a diagnosis that exists. Some people have that kind of attachment pattern. And so what was happening was people were getting a lot worse before they got better. And then they got better, but you want to avoid people getting worse, and that isn't everybody, but it was some people. So when I say that EMDR is more cognitive and not as somatic as Brainspotting, please don't send me an email and say, actually, there's a somatic model or EMDR is activating the subbrain. Like, I have all this. I was an EMDR clinician for 2 years, so I bought all the books. Like, I've got $500 of stuff. I've got thousands of dollars of audiobooks. I've got those prompts. I know that there's a way to start in the body. But what you're doing with EMDR is the clinician is totally in control. So you're starting in the body. And then you're telling them, feel this, go here, and getting in touch with their trauma map or whatever you're using, and then you're immediately having them think about it. And the clinician's saying, okay, now we're going to replace this belief with that belief, and after the distress comes down, you're going back in and you're saying, okay, here's the good belief, you were powerless, you weren't free, we got rid of that, now think of a time you were powerful, okay, you were on the dock, you went swimming, you won the race, And so there's so much that is up to the clinician in a way that I don't think always gets to the bottom of things, because I for one, and the best analysts in the world sometimes would just not get to the places that are really the problem. It's not to say the symptom doesn't get better. It doesn't, even that the disorder doesn't go away or the diagnosis isn't cured. But there's more down there. So what I noticed when I did EMDR with complex trauma patients and dissociative disorder patients was that the pupil would jump over a spot. So I'm doing the eye movements and I'm watching the pupil. And the pupil's going whoop, whoop. But it's so fast, there's no way a person could consciously be trying to do that. And also there would be a dilation. There'd be a wiggle, right here. And so I was like, well, what is that? Why are they not going there? So I started to slow down and kind of hold my finger in there. And when I would do that, the person started to have these huge cathartic, emotional explosions. Sometimes they would dissociate, sometimes they would lose time. Sometimes they would see things from the trauma, and so I was like, what is this? I've been a clinician for not very long, I don't know what I'm doing, why is this happening? And I, was scared that I was going to mess people up, but my patients were like, no, we had EMDR before, or not all of them, but some of them had, and they were like, we want that. Stop there, do that thing you were doing, go back in the room. And so I was thinking, okay, so the body remembers, what my muscles were doing in a different way that my intellectual faculties are working. That subcortical body brain, it remembers all this stuff from the traumatic event. It remembers that my heart felt like a black hole, that my legs got tight, that my back had to do this, that I wanted to curl into a ball, that I wanted to just dissolve and disappear. Okay, it holds all that information, so it makes sense that it would also kind of remember where my eye was looking. Maybe I'm activating the spot they were looking during a trauma, or just the spot that their eye associates with a certain emotion, because I was ashamed in school, so I always kind of looked down at my desk and played with my stuff, and now my eye goes down here to self-soothe when I'm overwhelmed. Whatever, maybe that's the thing. So, long story short, I paid for all these EMDR consultations, and because EMDR is manualizable, everybody was like, no, you just got to do this. You do the 15 movements, and I'm like, that didn't work. The patient was like, anyway, it was not helpful. So somebody said, well, it sounds like what you're doing is brain spotting, and I was like, what's that? Because I was just desperate for help, and I had these cases, and a lot of people had, DID and severe issues. I was seeing a ton of patients. I was working more than I've ever worked before at that point. And so I bought the brain spotting book, and I read it, and I was like, this is interesting, but it doesn't have any of the things that I was seeing or assuming in there. And so then I just was like, I'll bite the bullet. I'll pay, a couple $100 for an hour to talk to David Grand, who is the man who invented brain spotting. And like, what if, I need help? Like, I've paid for all these consultations, I'm not getting anywhere. And so David listened to me, and he was like, yeah, you've discovered exactly what I discovered. And I was like, well, why didn't you put these things in the book? And he was like, I don't want people to think about that. I don't want them to conceptualize it that way. What I want them to do is just go in and make room for the patient, have an experience. And then he told me one of the most helpful things anyone's ever told me. He said, you do not know how what you are doing feels. So you need to sign up for a brain spotting training, and you need to feel it before you do anything. And I was like, yeah, I've done EMDR, man. It didn't do anything for me. Like, I kind of felt something, but, he was like, no, you need to do it. And he was very loving. He was very nice. David's a very nice guy. And so I signed up for a brain spotting training. Didn't expect anything. And I dissociated. It was during COVID, so, it was on the computer. And so I was like, yeah, this isn't going to do anything, man. Like, how would my eye be able to perceive depth? Like, I'm looking at a computer screen, whatever. It can, because it worked. I don't do brain spotting via teletherapy, but it can be done. I had this deep experience with brain spotting where I was pulled under my life, and I felt my cognition go away. I lost language, which for me, I'm a very talky, verbal person, and that was extremely distressing. But I want to be distressed with therapy. I just not gotten anybody to push me there after going to 14 different styles of therapy. No one had done that. And so brain spotting worked, and I immediately felt like David's explanation for what was happening when different neural networks were activated in the brain was probably closer to what I had heard in all of these EMDR consultations. And one of the reasons that is that what he told me that was very helpful was that EMDR is opening up all of these brain spots just a little bit. And some of them might happen to be on that axis, but you might have a brain spot up here. You may have a resource spot down here, right? And you're not hitting those, you're missing those in EMDR. But usually, they're going to kind of be around the mid-visual range. And so you're kind of starting to get the subbrain interested, and that's why people have these powerful emotional breakthroughs that are so cool in EMDR. But it's not as surgical. You're opening up too much at once, and that's assuming they have a lot of spots. Some people don't have enough trauma, they just have one thing. And that's why EMDR works for who it works for. And it's not a bad modality. I don't have anything against it. I do think that the theoretical basis for it is just kind of wrong. And so, our eye remembers how far away something was and what it was, and there's some tricks to get people to go into processing. Brain spotting uses eye position, and it doesn't really move that much. I move a little bit, and there's some brain spotting modalities further on that move. I'll do a z-axis bounce, when somebody is about to go out of processing, I can tell that there's more there, but they've done most of it. I'll leave the spot on the z-axis, which is, this is the x, this is the y, this is z, this is the distance from the eye, and I'll creep back up to the spot real slowly and then stop, and people will go back under. So there's some movement, but really you're not moving a ton. And that the brain spot is there because the person almost immediately feels very, they lose balance a lot of the time. There's kind of involuntary muscle movements. You can spot them in the face, but you may see them on the rest of the body. And I read the pupil more than most people because I came to brain spotting backwards. I was already doing it and I didn't know what it was, and then I learned the brain spotting way, but I'm still keeping the stuff that was working for me before. But I'm watching what the pupil is doing in the eye. So the other eye movement therapy, and David started brain spotting a lot more recently than Shapiro because he was an EMDR clinician too. He worked with Shapiro, and then he saw his thing. He was treating an ice skater. The ice skater was a child, and her parents had divorced, and they had blamed her for the divorce. And so she was having performance problems when she was doing the skating that had nothing to do with her body. They had to do with her body-brain. It was a trauma response. And so he was doing EMDR, it wasn't working, and then he saw her pupil wibble, he stopped, And she went into deep processing, and he felt like his intuition just called him to stop there, and it was this kind of beautiful discovery. And that was in the 80s, and Brainspotting is probably right now where like EMDR was in the 80s. People are kind of getting left behind if they don't have it because so many patients want it. And one of the best ways to see where the industry is going is not research, because research is going to be 10 or 15 years behind the times. It's going to be, what are people saying, this worked for me, go get it. And the economic pressure on social workers and private practice therapists to go get that training, what's growing is modality. That's a pretty good indicator. When we opened in Birmingham, there were 2 people in the state that did Brainspotting. One of them had it on their psychology day, but she wouldn't even really see people. We've been open for about 3 years, and now there's 56 people just in this region, if you Google, that have it. Everybody in the building that we're at that isn't affiliated with Taproot, they have it. It's growing really fast because people like it, which is great. Like, I'm glad. We don't want to have a monopoly on that. I'm glad that more people are getting their training. If you're a therapist, you should think about getting it. So there's one other kind of eye movement that is kind of lost in this transition from EMDR to Brainspotting, and that's called EMI, and it's a thing a Canadian psychologist came up with. There's not a ton of trainings. You won't encounter EMI. Like, it's called eye movement integration, and it's about doing different eye movements. It's not bilateral stimulation. There's a theoretical framework of these different movements work for different things. Nobody has this training. It never caught on. It's not something that you can get easily, and you won't just find somebody in your area doing EMI.
They kind of failed to market well. I don't know. I knew the least about this of like any of them. And I want to say too, like, I'm not an EMDR certified therapist, Brainspotting certified therapist. I'm not a trainer. I'm somebody who's gotten the trainings. I have phase 1 and 2 and several other trainings of Brainspotting. Because Brainspotting was open enough that David wanted people to take it and then did new things, and they did. And so there's movie spotting, wave spotting, distance spotting, blank spotting, like all of these other forms of brain spotting that are really effective. That people invented because he didn't want the model to be locked down and then the Shapiro did. And that's neat. Where brain spotting doesn't work is sometimes I feel it's so open-ended that therapists they don't push somebody into processing the way they should. I've got a video about that. Or not should, because I don't know how to do it. I'm not saying that I'm the best expert about doing it. If you find somebody who says, oh, I only tried that, it doesn't work, if you ask them what happened, the therapist said, what do you feel here? What do you feel here? What do you feel here? And they didn't just look at the eye and say, no, go ahead, hang out here long enough, you're going to feel something. They weren't willing to just kind of push the patient into the experience in the way that sometimes you need to. EMDR, most people who have trauma, they also have a hypervigilance, and they kind of have I don't want to be manipulated, I don't want to be mistrusted. They can think their way out of things. And one of the things they can think their way out of is you suggesting that they process. Sometimes that process works, maybe depending on where the brain spots are. With brain spotting, if you hang out there long enough, your brain is going to go offline, you're going to start processing, you're going to maybe lose time, and you're going to know that it's working. You're going to feel it. I mean, some people, when you really hit an activation spot, it is like you were hooked up to a car battery. Like, you can't pretend that does not work. There's some phase 2 and 3 and other, things for brain spotting. Brain spotting uses something that EMDR doesn't. One of them is called activation and resource spots. There's activation spots that kind of make you feel worse, and feel worse or spike anxiety so that you can process trauma. And then there's research spots that you can go to kind of ground and get a baseline. Sometimes you have to ground and get a baseline and self-soothe and calm before you can even spike a resource spot. There's also an activation eye and a resource eye, depending on where the spot is. You've got one eye that makes you feel worse and speed processing up, and you've got one eye that makes you feel better and speed processing down. So if you're, highly dissociative and we're trying to keep you here, you would slow the processing down so you don't dissociate. If you're incredibly resistant and you're having a hard time feeling it, we'd go to the activation eye so we can spike it and go a little faster. So there's lots of really neat tricks, and I think brain spotting is a pretty beautiful process. Everybody at Taproot is able to do that. It sees results, and it's a neat thing. So brain spotting has a pretty big Venn diagram overlap with this thing called ETT. ETT stands for Emotional Transformation Therapy. And the guy who invented it is called Stephen Vasquez. There are a couple obstacles to its adoption. People in Texas tend to like it more. You see more of it in Texas, and I think that's because the inventor is from there. But also, Brainspotting, you're just using a pointer. EMDR, you're using your hands. The pointer's, a couple bucks on Amazon, so it's not expensive. ETT does require, a couple hundreds of $1,000s of equipment, so that is like one thing where that hurts its adoption. I'm qualifying that because more people have heard and had a good experience with Brainspotting than ETT. And I don't think it's ETT's fault. Like, I think it's a good model. I think it's doing a lot of the same things that Brainspotting is doing, and more people who are into Brainspotting should look it up. So ETT is interesting. I was trained in this like, a month ago, and I've done it for a month. And I've only got the first training. I've got an understanding of, read books and whatever of the other modules, but I don't want to make it sound like I'm an ETT master. It's not. I'm trying to let patients know the difference between these because so many people ask about the difference in movement therapies, or just brain-based medicine therapies. So ETT does a lot of different techniques, but the big thing is that they don't use eye position like Brainspotting does, or eye movement like the EMDR does. What they use is color. So Stephen Vasquez has these, or Dr. Stephen Vasquez has these incredibly accurate and expensive devices that can produce color at very accurate hues. And what that does basically is it activates a neural network just like Brainspotting based on color instead of eye position. And so, he put tens of thousands of cases to this computer and was like, I'm going to see how color affects people. But he kind of thought, maybe certain colors treat certain diagnoses, or certain people that have certain background, they're going to respond to whatever. It turns out that's not the case. We all respond to color about the same. It doesn't matter the diagnosis or your race or your, anything. Certain hues of color activate very similar somatic issue and an emotion associated with that somatic thing. And so when I went to the training, it was another thing like Brainspotting where it was this is woo and out there, and I didn't expect to do anything. If I hadn't done it, I wouldn't really get hurt. But he was able to say, okay, based on where this issue is showing up in your body, and based on the way you're describing the emotion, you're going to dissociate somewhere between these hues. And he would say, what is this color? And everyone else could see, okay, that's yellow-green. And the person who's processing it's I can't see that. So, I went up to do it, and I was trying to look at this board with the color. It's not a screen, it's just a printed board like a paint chip. It's giant. And I was my eyes know this is blue. I could see it was blue for a second, and then it turns black. It's jet black. I can't see it. And he would be okay, you're dissociating. Just, ground yourself, breathe, come out of it. And after you ground yourself and breathe, now look at it again, and I could see it as blue for a minute, and then it's black. So I was, that's pretty convincing, none of the other colors are doing that. Everyone else could see those. I couldn't see this one. The person who's processing yellow, they couldn't see that. So, that is interesting. And one of the things that it does is, I treat primarily dissociative disorders. One of my theories has always been that everybody dissociates a little bit all the time. That it's a pretty normal function of the brain. And then when it gets up here, patients notice it, and therapists can start to notice it, and you can start to treat it, and it becomes a problem. But then we all have little emotions that we don't like. I don't like to feel trapped, or I don't like to feel out of control, or I don't like to feel I'm not in a competition. I like competitions to under the rules. I don't know the rules to the spirituality or this open stuff. We all have something we're avoiding, and a lot of times we collect around the places we avoid, these bad experiences or trauma really activates them. And then we really avoid them. And so we're dissociating a lot around those and we're not, avoiding that by cognition. And so what this ETT thing does is it lets you basically have a patient like this color chart and detect this dissociation immediately before the patient's aware, before the therapist could see that somebody's dissociating. So you can start working with it on this really immediate level and doing brain training similar to biofeedback, where you're trying to stay grounded on this color. And then you're slowly learning to see the color, and as you're learning to see the color, you're learning to hold the emotion. And as you're learning to hold the emotion, the symptom and the thing you're avoiding goes down. And we saw that happen in training. I've seen that happen in patients. There's tons of advanced things you can do with ETT. There's light blinking devices for later on. There's a thing where light comes in from different angles. I've had those done to me. I've not administered them yet. And when they were done to me, I was extremely doubtful anything was happening. And then I had some processing, and I did see it different. So I think there is something to it. One of the things that I did learn we did have done is the ETT wands. And so the eye movement that Stephen Vasquez uses, I think this is one of the more brilliant discoveries that I've heard, is like he uses these colored wands and they have the color associated with spectral chart on these wands. So the therapist gets them and they combine 1 or 2 or 3 based on the issue that you're working with to keep your brain on that wavelength. I wasn't super convinced that the color was doing a lot until I started working with it. But the thing that he does that's super, I think this is brilliant, is that because I've seen this for 6 years, and I didn't have conceptualization. I was kind of using it to flag trauma and association, but you put it in a way that's beautiful. And he said that, that reptile brain that we have, I don't know if you've ever seen like a lizard or a chicken, something that has evolved part of the brain yet. They are missing the part of the brain that lets them make slow movement. So a chicken or a lizard, something like that, their heads jerk like this, and their eyes jerk like that. Like they can't just be like, hey, what's up? Roll their eyes. That's a mammalian midbrain invention of the brain. So when somebody is in a traumatized experience being controlled by trauma in this cortical brain, their eye jerk. And I've seen that for years, but I never thought about why it was. And so with Brainspotting, what I normally did is I was like, okay, the eye's kind of pinging in this pattern. Usually the pattern is that, which is maybe why I movement therapy, EMDR, if it works, is that you're hitting that meridian. But the pattern can be anything. I've watched my patients and I keep talking, okay, tell me about this. They start talking about how dad made me feel trapped during the trap thing. My eye goes, zip, zip, zip. And I'm like, maybe that's a false positive work way. Zip, zip, zip. It's a very jerky, intentional thing. Somebody else is going like this, whatever, you notice it, you see it 4 or 5 times, you know that that's the pattern, and then you start processing. And so what Stephen Vasquez says is that because the jerky reptile brain is doing this, to engage the mammal brain and bring that information to integrate it and bring it into intellect and not just the body, you get your color wand and you move the patient's eye along that pattern very slowly while they're talking about the issue. So I've been doing that, and the results are crazy. Like, I wasn't really expecting it, Tom, and you're just slowing their eye down, and then the person all of a sudden starts understanding the emotion they're feeling. I'm not saying anything as a therapist. I'm like, hey, tell me more about that. Okay, stay with the part that you were describing. Keep telling me what that's like. And I'm doing the eye movement, and the person's like, oh my God, I never understood this, but that's what I was feeling the whole time. And I'm like, I didn't tell you that, and you felt this a zillion times and gotten upset. We've never understood it because you're slowing down the reptile brain, you're engaging the mammal brain and understanding what the reptile brain's trying to tell it, but you never made it up there. And so some of the colors, because you're supposed to switch the colors that the wands are, based on the issue that you are guiding them through, what you're talking about, or what you want to lead them to. And I was kind of doubtful. I was like, is him switching these colors, is that really doing something? I mean, I got to say, I'm trying to disprove this stuff. I come into it as a skeptic, and after doing this for 2 weeks, I'm having a really hard time proving it wrong, because the patient's sitting there and they're talking and they don't know what the colors mean. They have no understanding of what I'm doing or what I'm doing. And I'm like, okay, you're talking about how you don't know who you are. This is about ego. It's about identity. It's what the boundaries of myself in, boundaries of the world again. You're talking like you're part of your family or you're part of your mom. And I want you to think about ego and identity. So I reach for the mid-orange color. And I've got my orange wand, and I'm pairing it with whatever else they're talking about, and I pull it out. As soon as they see that orange, they start going like, I'm different than mom. I don't have to be part of her. I'm my own person. And it's like, okay, well, wow, you're talking about identity. Okay. Later on, they're talking about, I just feel trapped. I feel, like somebody has got me in a cage. I can't get out. I'm like, okay, let's get yellow. That's the one that's trapped, and we're doing it. And then all of a sudden, the person's like, that wasn't, I was kept there my whole life, and I shouldn't have been. I don't have to be trapped. I'm like, well, all right, again, trying to disprove this stuff. The person's talking about communication. How do I bring my inner world out here? What if people don't get it? Maybe that overlaps with identity. So I'm grabbing an orange and a blue. And then all of a sudden, I just can't communicate. I don't feel safe in communication. When I'm talking, you're trying to get misunderstood. I'm afraid I'm being misperceived. And it's like, and a lot of these patients, I've had for a long time. We've done Brainspotting, we've done EMDR therapy, we've done somatic therapy, we've done ETR, we've done Brainspotting. And they've said these same things over and over and over again. We've made progress on other stuff, but they kept not, getting the thing. And all of a sudden, you see this color, and I'm not telling you anything. They're just there. So, you can say this is an evidence-based, blah, blah, blah. I felt it work on me. And my thing is I ask patients, do you want to try this, or do you want to do it again, or what do you want to do today? And I just leave them in control of their treatment, because I think people know what was working for them and what wasn't. And people are preferring Brainspotting. People are preferring ETT. So those are the biggest differences that I've been there. EMDR, EMI, which is not very well known, it's not very well distributed, Brainspotting, and ETT. So if you want any information about this, we have more than you would ever want on our webpage, gettherapy.com. There's a ton of information. ETT, there's a lot more to that I'm going into. Brainspotting and EMDR, there's a lot more. This is kind of to help patients decide what they pay for or what the provider can decide. I will say, though, that while I like ETT a lot, I can see it being something that can only work not only work, but only maybe be recognized that it works by a person who's already kind of in the space. Because I think the effect is pretty subtle. Like people are realizing stuff, like it is working, but I don't know that they know why. Whereas Brainspotting, when you really get somebody going, I mean, for me, it felt like somebody was shocking my back with a car battery. Like came into it as a complete skeptic, and I was completely safe. It was like I knew that EMDR worked for patients. It didn't work for me. I was going to take the tips from Brainspotting and try and bring it in, and then I felt my body moving around the patient. So if you've got somebody that's an A-type, they don't think therapy works, they're not going to stick around long, they don't have a ton of respect for you. I mean, personally, I wouldn't say, we're now going to use the color green because I just think that you're going to use the patient. Maybe later, after they trust you, but your Brainspotting gives you a pretty immediate result. You cannot talk yourself out of this. You feel something. You feel a consistent thing every time. It is testable. It's objective. You're continuing to feel it in the same place, the same feeling, in this other place, a different feeling, in this different place. So, I mean, you can replicate it, and people get it. ETT works and it's interesting, but I think that patients will tend to be more intuitive, and patients will tend to be more feely. They're going to be open to it, and they're going to trust you. Other people who don't trust you, or who don't trust therapy, or who don't trust emotion, or who don't trust intuition, I can see those patients getting better and then leaving and being like, that was bullshit, somebody held us with here, I just made myself better. Which is fine. I mean, the point is not to get approval or recognition, the point is to do a good job. But I do think that those patients, they may have worse experience. There's a lot more to ETT, there's a lot more to all these. But I did want to do that because I've gotten requests for it in 6 months, and I just not this time. I hope that you guys are doing good, and if you've got a question, let me know. And Bigelow green tea or Twinings is going to be a whole lot of great value for you after that. If you know anything about how peaches cost, what paper costs, I hope everything's going good, and talk to you soon. Check out our website, www.therapybirmingham.com. And if you like any of the stuff in this video, there's also a podcast with way more information than you could ever want about therapy, art, and science, psychology. Have a good night.